So the Greens, I would imagine, would have been the most ardent opponents of what you were trying to do. Have they articulated precisely what they find objectionable about this motion?
Yeah, I mean, the Greens, I knew just from looking at how the debate had gone on this motion interstate, would have a firm stance against it. And their argument is that supporting this motion inhibits in some way freedom of speech to criticise Israel.
Oh, they care about freedom of speech.
Hang on.
The Greens care about freedom. So they're going to be repealing Section 42 any minute now.
Yeah, you think so?
Interesting. Go on, Sarah. Sorry.
So, SA Best had the same argument, but it's really, to me, very concerning that would even be a concern. I mean, it states within the definition that you absolutely can criticise Israel. Legitimate criticism similar to that levelled against other countries is absolutely not considered anti-Semitic. So to conflate support of this motion with inhibiting freedom of speech is definitely not correct. But for me, even though the Greens were against it, really they weren't the bloc. It was Labor that was the bloc. Between Labor and Liberal, we had enough support to get it through. And for me, it was very fascinating to see that the Liberal Party were able to decide, really within a couple of days. The Leader of the Opposition, David Speers, spoke to me personally and said, Sarah, you have our full support for this. He wrote a public letter supporting the IRA definition, and that was really very simple. And I would say that about half of Labor as well were on board straight away. This was really a no-brainer. But it was interesting that the other half were very difficult to convince. And after delaying the motion for the first time, the vote, due to apparently lack of time for Labor to consider it, we then almost delayed it for a second time, again, because they were going to vote no. And at this stage, I really reached out to the Premier, Peter Malinowskis, because I thought, he's probably got a lot to keep abreast of. Maybe he's not aware of this. This is going to be very embarrassing for Labor. They've supported it in 2 other states. The Prime Minister has supported it and written a letter to the Israeli Prime Minister reiterating his support of the IRA definition. So I reached out to Peter Malinowskis by mobile, which he had given me, which I hadn't done before, by text through his staff, but I never heard back from him on this, and I thought that was interesting, really.
Daisy.
You mentioned the Greens and their rather virulent reaction to this. I've always been curious. The Greens and Progressives, they go on about how they're tolerant and they're pro the Jewish community and they're against anti-Semitism, but then they come up with this stuff when it comes to Israel. What is Progressives' problem with Israel?
I do not fully understand that. I know that here we definitely had a lot of influence. We've got a large Palestinian community here. We had a number of protests about this motion, and I guess that's the other really interesting factor here. It was the first thing I put up in Parliament, and as I said, I assumed it would go through fairly simply because it had gone through in other states, and it wasn't a bill. It was simply a motion to acknowledge anti-Semitism. And it was very interesting to see that really, other than a couple of other pieces of legislation, this motion probably caused the most unrest within the parliament. And we had at least 2 protests from the Palestinian community on parliament steps, as well as a fairly large letter-writing campaign as well.
Wow.
And I can only assume that influenced things here.
Well, Sarah Game, thank you so much for joining us, walking us through this. Great work, because I think any sane, rational person would have to say that there's absolutely nothing wrong with what you're doing. And in fact, it is all to the good to fight the evil cancer of anti-Semitism. Sarah Game, thank you so much for your time. And I reckon there's going to be really interesting times ahead for Anthony Albanese as he deals with the Labour caucus factions that are so pro-Palestinian, because he has, to his great credit, has been very pro this definition and generally pro-Israel.